All right, hey, welcome to this video on how the brain works, and we'll talk about the free energy principle as well as predictive processing, which are two theories of cognitive neuroscience. And just as a caveat, I'm not a neuroscientist. I have a master's in neuroscience, but this isn't really my area of expertise. I think what I'll try to do is summarize to the best of my ability these complex topics and make it simple without the math, and then also how we can apply it to our mental fitness in a very practical way. So, the free energy principle has been compared to Darwin's theory of natural selection in terms of its far reaching implications for all species. And in fact, it even applies to particles. It's theoretical, it comes from physics and statistical physics specifically. There's a lot of math and theory, and it also has been applied to the brain. And so that's what we'll focus on here. It's the very simple premise of the free energy principle is if things exist, what must they do? That's the question that it attempts to answer. And the answer is basically they resist falling apart. It makes sense, right? Every kind of organism is trying to maintain its boundaries in a world that's constantly changing and where things are trying to eat it. And it's trying to maintain that system despite all the forces that are working against it. And it does so by having an internal model of how the external world works. And what free energy principle says is the organism tries to minimize free energy, which in this case can be thought of as the difference between the internal model and the actual external world. So I guess one analogy would be like a king who's defending their castle, and the castle is like the boundaries of this. Could be a little organism, or it could be us with like the skin as our boundary. And we're trying to stay alive and we're trying to replicate our genes. And so what we do is actually we lack direct access to the outside world. In other words, the brain is kind of like, imagine if the king couldn't see outside their castle walls and they were just getting reports from different messengers coming in who are saying, oh, to the east there's some enemies, and to the west there's grain that we could, or some kind of resource that we could mine for. And so that's kind of the brain with the eyes and ears and nose and sense of touch and our other senses. It's getting this information from the external world, and then it's trying to guess what's out there to the best of its ability. And the free energy principle says that it does its best to essentially make that model as accurate as possible and minimize the surprise, minimize the unexpected events. Essentially, going back to the king and his castle, minimize the surprise attacks from enemies. And this could include things like getting a spider bite or just maintaining our internal body temperature. So, trying to be in an environment that's not too hot or cold. We might open a window if the brain registers that we're getting too hot. And also our glucose levels, so we'll know to get some food if those drop too low. And so there's just a lot that the brain is trying to keep track of, and all of it can relate to this internal model as an attempt to minimize free energy. So that brings us to predictive processing, which is a more specific theory of cognitive neuroscience, which talks about how the free energy principle, this idea that the brain or the organism needs to build an internal model and then minimize the uncertainty or the surprise in the external world. How does it actually do that? So based on nature, like evolution, our genes that pass on information from our ancestors, as well as you could say nurture, like our entire life's experience, we develop these models. So for example, a baby already has, when they're born, there's already some general software in this model. Like for example, the fear of heights is pretty much a natural human instinct. I don't think babies have to learn that one. They do have to learn object permanence, which means that they have to learn that, like, if they see something and then it's out of their field of vision, it's not it hasn't disappeared forever. It's still there. It's just they're not looking at it in the moment. They have to actually learn that. So for a while, a baby's world is whatever they're currently seeing in a way. But the idea is we develop these internal models, both from some of it comes pre-downloaded, and then other parts of it we learn as we interact with the world, as we go to school and download more information, and then we make mistakes. We gather all these life experiences that are building, these memories are building this internal model of how the world works and our place in it and who we are and how to respond in an adaptive way. And then, so the brain has this algorithm. This is what predictive processing says is like, how should the brain update its model of the world? If it gets some information, some new information, like let's say that you heard there had been an alien invasion, and your brain needs to decide whether to completely change its worldview and act on that information. But how does it decide whether to do that? Well, it uses a mathematical formula called Bayes' theorem. And this was just the optimal way of deciding whether to update beliefs. And it would basically weigh the odds that that new information is correct against the odds that its prior belief that, that there's not an alien invasion, that alien invasions are very rare. It would need to weigh that new evidence, and it would determine like the reliability of the source. So if the person who told you this was the president or a very well trusted scientist, or a bunch of people told you this, you read it on some credible news sources, you might be likely to believe it and to update your beliefs about the world, and then kind of have to reckon with this alien invasion. However, if you heard the information from a kind of untrustworthy conspiracy website, you'd be unlikely to believe it and update your beliefs. But this is happening not just on the macro level, but also on the micro level. Even, let's say, in a dark room, you see something that looks like it could be an animal, and your brain is trying to decide whether to react and run away from the animal. And so it's trying to figure out whether this kind of blurry shape is matches its internal model of, predator or, animal that I should run away from. And it's trying to essentially take the limited information it receives and say, how likely is that sensory information to be an animal that's worth running away from? So in predictive processing, there are hierarchical layers that are predicting in this way. We just talked about how it happens on the macro level, like with our beliefs, as well as the micro level, like whether to believe something that we see or kind of see in the dark. And you can imagine that the upper layers are trying to predict the input from the lower layers. And if there's something unexplained in a lower layer of the hierarchy, it creates what's called a prediction error. And that's what would cause us to try to figure out, like, what is that unexplained new input that doesn't match our model? Is that an animal that I see in the dark, or is it just a chew toy, or a piece of furniture? And then if the information is accurate, it updates its internal model. It's always refining that internal model. So there's much more nuance here and complexity and scenarios to apply it to. You can read more about that in some of the papers that I've linked to below in the resources. But I just want to apply this to something we've already talked about in this course on a very kind of practical level. We discussed dependent origination, which is a theory about how the mind works subjectively from a meditation master, Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha who laid this out over 2,500 years ago. And I see a lot of similarities. There's a lot of alignment between predictive processing and dependent origination. So, what both of these theories are saying is that larger mental events like thoughts and stories and beliefs start they're kind of built up from very tiny events, little bits of sensory information. Let's see how this happens with an example. So, let's say you see a shape with your eye, and in dependent origination, this would be sensory contact. In predictive processing, this is the sensory information that's coming into your eye. And so it's basically just the raw sensing of the external world. Next, there's this kind of interest in what we just saw if it doesn't match our internal model. And in predictive processing, this is called a prediction error. In dependent origination, this would roughly map onto Vedana or feeling tone. Like if you saw a little black speck on the rug and it kind of looked like a spider, it might create a negative feeling that draws your attention to it because you're kind of your brain is telling you there might be something there worth getting away from or worth doing something about. So next in this chain of events, there's this kind of attempt to either update the internal model or resolve it somehow, like act in a way that eliminates the prediction error, the potential threat. And in terms of dependent origination, this would be the craving link called tanha. So this is where you would have an urge to do something about it. Next in predictive processing is if you're deciding what to do next, you would start thinking about it and run these counterfactual scenarios like, all right, if I get up, then I could go put it out of the house, or I could squash it, but I don't like to kill things. And also, what would I kill it with? And maybe the better solution is just to ignore it. That's all counterfactual predictions in your brain that are trying to run different scenarios before you've actually chosen the best one to act on. And in dependent origination, this is the clinging link, these kind of repeat thoughts about what you've just seen. So next, and these don't map on perfectly, but you can think about how we've moved up the different layers of the brain. There might be several or even like dozens of these different layers. Each one is further away from the present moment and it's predicting further out. So there's another layer we can imagine above these immediate repeat thoughts that might be like our whole worldview and all of our reactions that we've ever had to spiders, and just this whole, it's like a stored library of beliefs and habits that we're drawing upon to make this decision about what to do. And in dependent origination, this link is called bhava, or habit patterns. For example, maybe you decide, I'm not somebody who kills spiders. That's like a sense of self. It's like an identity of who you are, and you want to uphold that identity. So you decide, all right, I'm not going to squash the spider. I'm going to ignore it. So that was all kind of in your mind, and now maybe there's a physical action or non-action. It could also be a verbal reaction, like you yell out or tell someone, "Hey, there's a spider. We got to do something about it." It's feeding new information into your internal model, and that's more likely to be how you'll respond in the future. And this is the jati, or the birth of action link in dependent origination. Okay, so that's how the brain works in a nutshell, based on the free energy principle and predictive processing. And then I've applied it to this ancient meditation framework called dependent origination, which is subjectively how the mind works. It's interesting how the two line up. But what's the use here? What's the value of this? And what's the real problem? We want a brain that will help us solve and plan in the future. One of the main problems is that our internal models are often maladaptive. In other words, they're running like old buggy software programs. For example, we worry a lot and we stress out a lot, and that might have kept our ancestors alive. If every little rustle in the bushes could have been a predator, could have been a saber-toothed tiger, that was useful for passing on our genes, but we don't want to be in a stressed out state, and we don't want to feel this fight or flight response for so much of our day. Nor do we want to be worrying and ruminating and regretting things when we're trying to fall asleep at night. This uses up so much of our mental energy. So there's all these predictions that kind of can get out of control and run awry. And we want more control over this predictive making process. And that's where bringing meta awareness to the process, becoming aware and recognizing when the mind is going spiraling out of control, gives us the power to release those thoughts, to relish in the pleasant moment right here. Hey, there's no problem to solve. And for those of us fortunate enough There's often no direct danger to our lives. We can enjoy what's here and remain there and retrain our brain in this way to be present more often and spend less time predicting things that won't actually happen. So the internal model naturally, just because of evolution, has a negativity bias. It's more biased towards things that would have been threats to us. And here we've been training to have more of a positivity bias towards positive and pro-social emotions. And that takes training. We're almost installing a new set of software here. The other problem is that the brain is very rarely in a state of complete balance, of homeostasis, because the environment's changing so rapidly and it's trying to resist falling apart. And of course, that's good. We don't want to starve to death. We want to make sure that we have the right temperature, but it's doing all this extra work. We have it pretty good now. There's not a saber-toothed tiger that's going to attack us. And so we want to more often come into a state of just feeling really good, a state of well being in the moment. And it turns out that's really challenging to do. The practices that you've been applying in this course have the potential to update your internal model in very helpful ways and also kind of see through the process in a way that allows you to step outside of the model and use the meta awareness to become aware of this process and kind of dive below these higher layers of concepts and thoughts and beliefs into the raw sensory information, into the raw experiencing of the present moment, which turns out to be much more blissful. And there's been some theories that apply predictive processing to meditation practice. One in particular that's gained a lot of momentum is called the many to none theory, or many to one. And this comes out of the University of Amsterdam by Dr. Helene Slegter and Dr. Ruben Lakonen. And they propose that meditation systematically deconstructs the higher layers of prediction. So we move from our thoughts and beliefs and concepts and bring us closer to the now as we learn to let go of those thoughts and come into the present moment with a number of different techniques. But in here, we've been using metta, compassion, joy, delight, and equanimity, as well as other tools that bring us into the present moment. And there's also some initial research out of Harvard that shows that indeed the jhana practice seems to deconstruct and kind of move down the predictive stack in the reverse order, although that research is still very new. Essentially, by reversing away from the far away predicting about the past and future and coming more into the now, we can gain insights and gain a new level of well-being, and also fundamentally change the way that our brains construct the world so that we can live a happier, more adaptive life. So simply put, the free energy principle and predictive processing say that our brain is a prediction-making machine. It's building these models of the external world to help us survive, and it updates them with new information. But because a lot of those models are outdated, we can use meditation to retrain them so they're more adaptive, pro-social, they lead to well-being, and overall, they lead to mental fitness. We can use the 4 R's throughout the day to do this. So your daily challenge today is to 3 times recognize unhelpful predictive thoughts and notice where those came from. You can kind of try to trace them back to their origins. Like, was it you heard a sound or a memory came up and then you started predicting what to do next? So just starting to see in your own experience how the brain is creating and fabricating your moment to moment reality. Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow for some more training.